And as our forum speaker today, we have Dr. Dalton Lyons, who's the head, Dr. Dalton Lyon, who is the head of the Upper School History Department at St. Mary's, and has recently published a book which is the subject of his conversation today. He has a PhD from the University of Mississippi, and his book reflects on Sanctuaries of Segregation, the Jackson Church campaign, which we're going to learn more about today. Dalton, we're so glad you're here. Welcome.
So it's St. Mary's Day here at Holy Communion with Reverend Bush and I. Thank you all for being here. It's good to see so many friends and colleagues out there. So I want to begin just by giving a little background on how I arrived at this project. There are many facets of the civil rights movement that have interested me as a student of history and now as a teacher of history, but one of the things that's interested me and confounded me, honestly, is how white church people were reacting to the movement and navigating that era. This is something that many activists talked about at the time, like Dr. King would write and talk a lot about, at length, about how segregation was not only unconstitutional, it was immoral, it was unchristian, and that forced separation of human beings was against the will of God, was against Christ's teachings and his gospel of reconciliation, that when, in an evangelical sense especially, this idea that sin must be confronted now, right? You can't let sin fester and be a part of our lives. So one of the things that really perplexed and frustrated activists at the time was that white Christians didn't see it that way. They didn't see segregation as sinful. So one of the tactics that civil rights activists employed to force white Christians to confront the sin of segregation was to show up and present themselves for worship at white churches on Sunday mornings. This was a direct action tactic that was called kneel-ins or sit-ins, and you see activists employing this throughout the South in the early 1960s. So in graduate school, I decided to research this tactic because the tactic itself interested me just as a technique of nonviolent resistance. The response by white Southerners intrigued me. What happened when black visitors started showing up at these white churches, white-only churches. There were white Southern Christians, I'm glad to report, who took a stand for inclusion. And in fact, if you look during this whole time period, most white churches admitted black visitors. Wouldn't exactly say welcomed them, but admitted them. But there were some white churches that prohibited black visitors from attending their churches. So I was really interested in analyzing this tactic and the motivations of people on all sides. From the activist standpoint, what were they really doing? Were they sincere in wanting to attend that church? Is that even a fair question? Are we sincere when we come here every morning? But what were they really trying to do? Were they trying to prove some larger point? Were they wanting to join that church? What was going on? And then on the flip side, for those churches that were closed to African American visitors and members, I just want to know, how could you possibly justify that? Historians don't like to admit any bias that they have, but if there's anyone that I'll admit to, it's this. Growing up in the church not long after these events, by the way, I just wanted to get a sense of how could you justify turning away anybody from the house of God. So I began researching the tactic of kneel-ins and this phenomenon of racial exclusion in white churches. And what I quickly found out was that, and this was about a decade, almost a decade and a half ago when I started researching this, is that there's very little out there on this. You might read about a kneel-in in a book about the whole movement, but no one was really investigating it except for one other person. And he's come, I know, to talk to your all's talk here, Steve Haynes at Rhodes, and his book, The Most Segregated Hour. But he was researching that at the time, and we linked up at the time. But other than the two of us, no one had really examined this. And He was looking at the story here in Memphis, and I was looking at what was happening in Jackson, Mississippi. So this project became the basis for my master's thesis and then my PhD at the University of Mississippi, and then this book that came out. So let me begin by giving a little context of Jackson for those who aren't familiar, but also, there are some ways in which it is similar to Memphis, but also some things that make it distinct. Like Memphis, Jackson has a very vibrant white church community and diverse church community, and they had been struggling for years with the issue of race long before black visitors started showing up. Many of these churches are led by well-respected men, most of them native Southerners, and most of them not segregationists. Jackson's the capital city, as you know, and the governor at the time in the early 60s was Ross Barnett. The mayor, the mayor's name was Alan Thompson, and both of them were avowed segregationists and churchgoers, and they were members of two of these churches that were part of this campaign. Ross Barnett, in fact, was a Sunday school teacher at First Baptist, right across from the Capitol. In Jackson, you have the nation's most organized and outspoken segregationist group, the Citizens Council, that's headquartered there in downtown, and many of those leaders are spread out in these churches. And then you have the media, which is always an interesting thing for me to look at, how this is being framed to the white readers of a city. And in this case, this was a media really dominated by one family who owned the Clarion Ledger. They also had an afternoon paper. And they are working, if you look at their newspaper, as I did over several years, I'm looking at microfiche, but if you look at it, you really get a sense of how hard this newspaper is working to sustain this narrative of Jackson, that this is a city committed to segregation. The African Americans are committed to segregation. That's what the white readers are told, and that any deviation from that, any discontent on the part of the black community is the work of outside agitators, and that is the phrase that you would read in the paper. And then finally in Jackson, you have a homegrown local movement of activists, and these are black ministers and laymen and high schoolers and college students, especially college students at Tougaloo College. So this Jackson movement kicks into high gear in May of 1963, and this is coming right on the heels of the Birmingham campaign, which is maybe more familiar to us, the Children's Crusade, and we can, conjure in our mind those images of children getting pelted by these high-powered fire hoses and such. And, that was a campaign that was violent and incurred a lot of arrests and damage, but in the end, the Birmingham city leaders did cave to an extent. And so what the Jackson movement wanted to do was to really replicate the success of Birmingham without the violence. So to get to that point, and this is outside of public view, you wouldn't read this in the newspaper, but there were white ministers and black ministers meeting a lot, and then these white ministers would get their white bishops and denominational leaders across the spectrum to meet with these black ministers, and this group served as facilitators with the mayor and with the Chamber of Commerce in Jackson. And so they tried, I guess is my point. But these meetings, the mayor wouldn't budge, the Chamber of Commerce wouldn't budge. And what the activists are trying to do is get the city to desegregate all the public accommodations, all the businesses. They had tried boycotts for several months at this point. They want black policemen hired, that sort of thing. So when the mayor and Chamber of Commerce wouldn't budge, this movement in Jackson then commenced sit-ins and picketing and marching like you saw in Birmingham, and hundreds arrested. It did get a little violent in parts. One of those, there's a violent sit-in at the Woolworth's lunch counter in downtown Jackson that is, if you go to our Civil Rights Museum, the National Civil Rights Museum, it is the sculpture you see memorialized with 3 or 4 people, 3 students and 1 teacher at a lunch counter there, if you've been there. So the mayor at this point is getting some pressure from the Kennedy administration, and the Kennedy administration is getting pressure from ministers in Jackson. And so what happens is the mayor does agree to some of the demands, your sort of compromise. And what happens with the movement now is that it really divides. There are some who, are saying, we can't afford any more arrests, we just need to pause. And then there are others who want to press ahead. This is not enough. This is not going to get us to where we want to go. So in that latter group were 2 men in particular. Got their picture here. On the left, you may recognize that's Medgar Evers, who is at the time, the NAACP's leader in the state, the field representative for the NAACP in Mississippi. And then on the right is a white Methodist minister from Vicksburg. His name is Ed King, and he was the chaplain at Tougaloo. So the 2 of them are part of leading this group of folks, mostly students at Tougaloo, who want to press ahead, but they know whatever they do, they're going to get arrested, right? So we've got to be strategic. And so in their minds, they thought, well, let's do something that we haven't done before, haven't tried before. Let's try to go to church. Let's try to desegregate these white churches. They had tried other forms of direct action, but what they now reasoned in their minds was that if change was going to come to Mississippi, and in Jackson in particular, then breaking down the barriers of segregation in the church would be a logical way to do it, and a good first step even. Their approach would also be very different from sit-ins and picketing and marching, because they really intended to engage in dialogue with the ushers at the steps, engage in dialogue with church members if they got in, and to be a public witness, to be a visible witness to the oneness of mankind. So while boycotts might tug at the wallets of white people, the church visits might tug at their hearts. They knew that every church had segregationists in them, and even some more, hardcore segregationists, you could say. But they also knew that there were folks in these churches that were uneasy with this, who were maybe a bit more silent on the issue, but it's one thing to maintain segregation in a private business, for instance, but quite another in the house of God. So it's really that sort of moderate side, this is silent moderates that they're trying to reach and tap into. So this is June of 1963, and they've decided to fan out across these downtown churches, and they go to some Methodist churches, Baptist, Lutheran, and a Catholic parish, and they don't get into any Protestant churches. The Catholic Cathedral of St. Peter the Apostle is the only one that admits them in. When they attempted to get into Galloway Memorial Methodist, the flagship Methodist church in that state, they were turned away, and their 2 ministers there, when they heard about it, minutes later resigned there on the spot. Medgar Evers was one of the adult drivers and organizers this Sunday. Ed King was actually up in New York raising money. And just so you get a sense of the chronology, this was on Sunday. He drove students to First Baptist that Sunday. It's on Tuesday, 2 days later, when he was murdered in his driveway. So taking students to a white church was one of the last things he did. Now, one of the big surprises that Sunday was that police did not arrest them. Police were there, directing traffic. They were there, and these activists fully expected to get arrested, but they were not. And so what this revealed, frankly, was an opportunity that church steps could be a place to demonstrate the immorality of segregation without incurring incarceration. So students failed to crack the closed doors of the city's Protestant churches that Sunday, so they went back the following Sunday and went to a few new churches that hadn't been targeted the weekend before, and one of those It's kind of embarrassing. I meant to bring a copy of my book, and I didn't do it. I was going to show you, but I've got the cover. And this is students who they were admitted to St. Andrew's Episcopal. And there were 4 students. They were a bit surprised by that, especially because they've been turned away everywhere else. One of these students, the one on the far left, if you can see, was Camille Wilburn, was an Episcopalian. She had grew up in Okolona, Mississippi, and in Vicksburg, and attended black Episcopal churches all her life. So they were admitted there, and that was a big moment. And this picture of these students descending the steps, this was on the front page of newspapers nationwide, because this, the story of Jackson that week had been the story of Medgar Evers' murder, and then his memorial service the day before on Saturday. And so just a very big moment. The young woman on the far right is Ann Moody, and I don't know if any of my students made it this morning. No, they did not. I wasn't giving them extra credit, but all St. Mary's sophomores for their summer reading read Ann Moody's autobiography, and she speaks to this being a huge moment for her. For the first time during this whole movement experience, she began to have a little hope because she got into this Episcopal church, and the rector there, Chris Keller, told her that you can come anytime. And for her, that was a big moment. So they returned Sunday after Sunday for the next 10 months, from June of '63 through Easter Sunday the following year, most Sundays, and they attempted to attend churches of every denominational flavor in Jackson and were turned away from most of them. And it's one thing that makes Jackson different from other cities, is that really the story of the white church community was a story of closed white-only churches. There were students who were arrested as well, and we'll get back to the arrest in just a bit. But during this campaign, every Methodist church, every Baptist church, Disciples of Christ, Lutheran, Presbyterian refused to admit black visitors. The Catholic and Episcopal parishes were the only ones to consistently admit them. So the book traces the evolution of this campaign, and it is an evolution, some highs and lows. It tells the story of all those involved that I could track down. And thanks to the internet, I was able to track down a lot of folks. And really tell the story of how folks are reacting to this and how they remember it 50 plus years later. So the book traces the evolution of the campaign and tries to tell all those stories. So it is very much a local history book about Jackson, but there are also some broader things I try to tap into, even if you're not interested in Jackson, that I think are relevant to all of us. This really is about how white church people were responding to the movement. In Jackson, as in Memphis and other cities, the white church was one of the key contested spaces during this era and had been for a while, but especially after that 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision. For instance, in Mississippi, the governor at the time, his name was Hugh White, and he was an elder at First Presbyterian in Jackson and a lay leader in that denomination, and he was asked his reaction by the press. What is your response to this blockbuster Supreme Court decision? And he said, if the Supreme Court decision is observed in my church, I will be forced to find some other place to worship. So that's the governor and lay leader at that time. So he understood, as did many white Christians, that schools would not be the only contested spaces in the years ahead, that beaches, art museums, libraries, all these would be contested spaces. And what the historical record shows is that through the 50s and early 60s, lay people and a few ministers, this is mostly a lay effort, fought very hard to preserve the white-only policies of their churches. So one thing that they did, there are a number of things, but one of the things that you see throughout the South, including in Memphis, is church lay boards like a vestry coming together and modifying their attendance policy and declaring that this is a church that is white only. And you see this, again, throughout the South. And beginning in 1960, so 3 years before this campaign, in 1960, you begin to see activists challenging these attendance policies. And you really see it in an organized way by a civil rights group called SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who was, when they were founded and chartered in 1960, they recommended this tactic, that this would be a tactic to, in their words, awaken the dozing consciences of white Southerners by carrying the problem of segregation to the church. The white Southerner has failed to recognize the moral wrongness of slavery. So kneel-ins were to wake us up, to wake white churchgoers up. So that summer of 1960 and that fall of 1960, there were about 200 of these kneel-ins that occur throughout the South, not in Jackson, but in other places. And as I said, they got in, mostly. And just to be clear, when we say this term kneel-in, there wasn't any kneeling going on, just so you know. These were not like a sit-in. It was really just to borrow that language of the movement. If they were blocked, they just simply left and left the premises. In nearly every case, there are a few where they didn't, but that was the exception. And the other thing that made them, I think that's relevant to know, is that they were never sort of solitary things. They were always done as part of a larger movement effort in that city. So they would, try to desegregate the publicly funded library or a lunch counter on Saturday, and then Sunday try to go to a white church. So when activists did this in Jackson beginning 1963, this suddenly made the reality of segregation and racial exclusion visible in a way that it hadn't been before. And stuck in the middle of all this, of course, is the minister, right? As I said, these ministers, nearly all of them, with really one or two exceptions in Jackson, were not segregationists. And I'm happy to report that my research really, that I've found, or I didn't really find, I'm bringing to light numerous examples of white Southern ministers taking a stand for inclusion, taking a stand for open doors, and doing so in religious theological language. And I just want to give one example. The pastor of First Christian Church, his name was Roy Hulin. First Christians is Disciples of Christ denomination, and that church was really the flagship church of that denomination in Mississippi. And Reverend Hulin, he's from Tennessee, by the way, outside Nashville, and he'd been at this church for 9 years at this point, so he had built up a relationship and a rapport, at least in his mind. But First Christian is one of these churches that had adopted a closed-door policy in 1961. 1961 is when many of when the Freedom Riders are coming through some of the cities in the Deep South, and when they're getting to Jackson, they're promptly getting arrested and sent to Parchman, to the prison. And so there was a worry in Jackson, and the police helped to notify churches and get the worry going that, what are you going to do if black visitors show up? You need to come up with some kind of plan. And so the plan for many churches was we're not going to let any black people in. So there's this minister who's been preaching inclusion, and from his standpoint in 1961, he felt that God had called him to these people. He also felt it's one thing to have a policy, it's another to enforce it. Maybe a bit naive in that point, but he did feel that he could help steer his congregation to a path of moderation. So he was resolved to stay. So here we are in 1963, and it's actually this group who was admitted to St. Andrews had just been turned away from First Christian, and that's actually how they ended up at St. Andrews. They had been turned away from First Christian, and he was giving a sermon that morning on this very thing. Of course, he didn't know that students had been turned away until after he'd given the sermon. But just imagine this kind of drama. You're giving this sermon that was centered on a passage in Paul's letter to Philemon, in which Paul is instructing his friend to welcome this runaway slave and welcome him and accept him as a brother in Christ. And Reverend Houlihan preached, men naturally at odds are transformed into brothers when they are individually drawn into the body of Christ. And he ended his sermon saying this: to deny any person on account of race or color access to the house of God is an unchristian act. This is not my house. This is not your house. This is not First Christian's house. This is God's house. This I believe. Of course, he didn't realize that he was rebuking his congregation. He thought he was just warning them. So he found out what happened, and as his son told me, he was pretty ticked off. And the following Sunday gave a sermon that was very fiery, in the mold of one of these Old Testament prophets, where he's condemning his congregation for not conducting themselves as Christians, not understanding Christ's teachings, not listening to him the last 9 years. So the elders of the church decided, okay, well, let's have a revote on the policy. In fact, this time let's open it up to the whole congregation. So later that summer in July, they had a revote, and it was overwhelming to maintain the status quo, to keep this white-only attendance policy. So you can imagine this now just emboldened the segregationists in the church to go after Reverend Houlihan. And I don't think we have this mechanism in the Episcopal Church, but and not to give anybody any ideas, but the way it works in the Disciples of Christ is you can get enough signatures on a petition to trigger a congregation-wide vote. This doesn't sound familiar, does it? Okay. And that's exactly what happened. They got enough signatures on a petition to trigger a vote on his status. And so this vote was upcoming in August. And in the meantime, there are people, and Houlihan had his allies and had his backers and defenders in the church, and they came to him, saying, I think we know how this is going to end up. For your own dignity, for the sake of your family, shouldn't you just resign? So his response to that was to mail a letter to all the church members in which he said this, and this is one of my favorite quotes from this whole project. So this is Reverend Houlihan. For me to resign voluntarily now could be taken as an indication of a lack of conviction concerning what I believe, or an unwillingness to take the consequences of preaching the full gospel. So when they did vote, he lost, and it was pretty overwhelming, about 6-1. His son told me this was one of these Sundays like Easter where people show up that you haven't seen in years, kind of thing. But and really among active members, it was very close, 50-50, and that was, he felt, meaningful to his dad. So Reverend Houlihan, he left the state, served out the rest of his ministry in Tennessee and in Kentucky. The church divided, experienced a decline in membership that continued through the 70s, and that's when many downtown churches throughout the country are grappling with demographic shifts. And the church physically shut down about a decade ago. So this is a sad story on one hand, and you find similar stories like this throughout Jackson, that when these ministers either resigned or were forced out, that this was tearing congregations apart. This church visit campaign was wrecking people's lives. You heard people say that at the time, and as I was interviewing folks, you would hear that line of reasoning to some extent. Because if you think about when Reverend Houlihan and others left, and you could say the same thing, leading Methodist ministers, the leading Lutheran minister, the leading Presbyterian minister, when they left, they were depriving their churches of a voice. They were depriving the whole community, the city of Jackson, of leadership. And so to say that this, as many did, that this campaign, for as noble as it is, it's doing more harm than good. Just do a cost-benefit analysis of it. It's doing more harm than good. And I think that is a fair way of assessing the campaign. But I try to emphasize something else, which is that the church visitors weren't creating a problem, they were uncovering a problem that already existed. That segregationists had been comfortable in their sanctuaries, but they were on unstable ground. Racial discrimination contradicted the basic teachings of their faith and was in defiance of the policies of their own denominations, which is another dynamic at work in this book, which it is a book about the relationship between churches and their regional governing bodies and their national governing bodies. When these churches adopted these policies, these closed-door policies, and then enforced them by blocking black visitors and encouraging police to arrest them, they were doing so in direct defiance of all the denominations, every single one of them. And so what this did, this local campaign, one key impact of it is that it really highlighted not only discrimination in that church, but discrimination in that denomination. And for many national leaders, it was very embarrassing what was happening in Jackson. And so what you do see by the mid-'60s and late 60s is denominations spelling out much more clearly than they had what their policies are, that compulsory segregation is against the will of God, that closed doors are against church policy. And you see this especially in the Methodist Church, and I'll come back to them in a bit. So that's one key impact of this campaign, is that you really see the language clear up, if it hadn't been already, what these denominations believe. So when the denominations did spell it out, you see segregationists retreating and forming breakaway churches, breakaway denominations. Disaffected Methodists, for instance, formed a new independent Methodist denomination that is still based in Jackson. Disaffected Episcopalians joined a brand new Southern-based, North Carolina-based denomination called the Anglican Orthodox Church. And I know we've had a few breakaway denominations, but this was an earlier one and different from more recent. So finally, this book does shed some light, or tries to, on the extent to which government was colluding with segregationists to keep these churches all white. For instance, many examples I could give, but the most obvious is the police. The refusal of these visitors to stop their campaign triggered 40 arrests. The arrests began in October, the campaign began in June. So after several months, when it was clear that this could go on forever, to try to put a stop to this, Jackson police stepped in and started arresting these folks out in front of these white-only churches. And they were arrested and charged with two things: trespassing and disturbing divine worship. The first arrests were in October. This is the scene you would see, by the way, out in front of these churches, this blockade of ushers. These were the first folks arrested, 3 students at Tougaloo. It happened to be Worldwide Communion Sunday. I mean, some of the stuff you can't make up. In October of '63, and this really drew national attention. Again, these are students arrested out in front of a Methodist church. Ida Hanna on the left, Betty Poole, and Julie Zogg, who was a transfer student to Tougaloo. Ida Hanna on her left told me, you know, she was one of these young people who wanted to get involved in the movement, but feared repercussions back home, didn't want to get arrested, but reasoned that this type of campaign was something she could do, and frankly, something that she could explain to her parents in case she got arrested. But as it turned out, she was arrested. How her parents found out about it was on the national evening news that night when David Brinkley announced her name. I mean, imagine that, your daughter is named anyway. And she just told her parents, I was just trying to go to church. How can you fault me for that? So because these first arrests occurred in front of a Methodist church, that drew attention nationally to segregation and racial exclusion in that denomination, in the Methodist denomination. So what happens from October through Easter Sunday is that Methodist ministers and bishops kind of descend on Jackson weekend after weekend to try to attend and join with the students. They would always be paired up with students. And most of those 40 arrests were black and white Methodist ministers. On Easter Sunday, this was sort of the climax of the campaign, 2 Methodist bishops, they weren't arrested, but they were turned away on Easter Sunday from Galloway Methodist Church. So they were arrested for trespassing, disturbing divine worship. For what it's worth, the arrests were all out on the sidewalk. The students were not kneeling and sitting in and refusing to leave, which I think is noteworthy. One arrest, I'll share this story just because you do get a sense of how surreal and bizarre all of this is. At Galloway, one of the church members there his name was John Garner, and he was also a teacher, a professor at Tougaloo, the physics professor. But he was a member of Galloway. His family went there. And you had these in every church. You had your allies within the church who wanted to do something. And as his case, he felt, if my fellow adults in my Sunday school class in particular could just hear from a student, if they could, not what they're reading in the Clarion Ledger, what they, hear from a student, they could hear the sincerity. This would be a native Mississippian, one of us, that could help lead to some positive change. And so that was his idea, was to invite a student of his to his adult Sunday school class. The other thing that this would do, like many of these larger churches, there was a separate education building that was distinct from the sanctuary, so you could avoid the police, avoid this phalanx of ushers blocking the church and kind of sneak in the education building. So that was the plan, and it didn't go as planned. They did make it inside the education building, but Garner and the student were swarmed. And I should say the student, her name was Joyce Ladner, from Mississippi, and was an activist, had already been arrested during the sit-ins earlier. But she goes on to a very distinguished career. She's the first woman president of Howard University many years later. So anyway, Garner and Joyce Ladner are arrested inside the education building, charged with trespassing and disturbing divine worship, and spend the rest of the week in jail. So John Garner, arrested in his own church for trespassing, trying to bring a visitor to Sunday school. So nearly all of these arrests were in front of Methodist churches, as I said, which Methodist leaders nationally were very embarrassed about. So they did something interesting, which is also kind of bizarre if you think about it. They set up a fund for students who found themselves needing bail money for trying to worship at a Methodist church. So you get arrested in Jackson, and then the denomination would bail you out. So I'll end with this. When you take a step back and consider the context of the campaign at the moment, you begin to appreciate that segregationists were actually losing in 63 and 64. One of my guiding questions was really, why are they putting up such a fight? Even just to admit some that doesn't, they'll move on to something else, right? By refusing to admit, that just makes you more of a target. So why are they putting up such a fight? So if you look at Jackson and, frankly, America at that time in 63 and 64, you really get a sense that segregationists are on their heels and losing at that moment. In Jackson, you had a mayor who had made some concessions that summer that your Citizens Council guy is not happy about. The desegregation of public schools in Jackson is finally starting to be phased in at that moment. And if you're a segregationist, there's this very ominous civil rights bill working its way through Congress that will be signed as the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So these white-only churches truly were one of the last spaces that segregationists felt that they could control. It was one of their last sanctuaries, and that is why they put up such a determined fight to keep them white-only. So this book started as an academic analysis for a master's thesis, trying to understand why things change or don't change and what motivates people. And I think it hit me as I began interviewing people down in Jackson, interviewing activists all over the country that were part of this. And I realized that this is much more than this. This isn't just some topic that will fill this academic requirement. Here in Memphis and throughout the South, we've been having this conversation about our past and how we recognize the past, whom we choose to recognize, and the importance of telling the truth about what happened in the past. The great Memphian Ida B. Wells once wrote, "The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth on them." The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth on them. So what I now appreciate is the role of history as truth-telling and the role of historian as truth-teller, and I hope this project, this book, in some way helps to do that. Thank you all. And I think we have some... Thank you. We've got some time for questions. Is it 10 o'clock? Okay. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you first and foremost for being here with us this morning and sharing with us. Didn't know and say what, and they laughed and they never came back. And I thought everyone ought to know.
Yeah, so if you haven't read or know about Haynes's work, he goes into the local story, and I think gets into that a little bit in that book. The Most Segregated Hour is the name of Haynes's book. Yes, sir.
Certainly, for me personally, power and control are chief motivators for racism. Mm-hmm. In your research and studies, have you come across other motivations that perhaps don't get as much publicity?
Power and control. No, I think it comes to that identity, which is integral to both those things. These are folks that they had perceived that this was their way of life, even though a student of history will know that segregation was a recent phenomenon. Frankly, it was not. You didn't go directly from slavery to Reconstruction to segregation. That segregation really didn't arise until the turn of the century here in Memphis, for instance. And even in these churches, there were black visitors at funerals, at weddings. Domestic workers would come with their employers to church until the mid-50s, and suddenly all of that shifts. So, no, I agree. I think it comes down to that, and I would add the word just identity linked in there. Yes, ma'am.
I would add fear and ignorance to that.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah, you see a lot of this at work in here. Yes, I'm sorry. So she said fear and ignorance would be added to control and power. Yes. And, in Jackson, an unwillingness to listen to your pastor. You really see that in these churches. And that's, for me, is part of the tragedy. These are folks who had tried, right? These pastors. And when activists showed up, the activists thought that they would get in because of who the pastor was. So, yes. Yes, ma'am. That's a good question. Did you all hear that question? It was I surprised in my research to the extent to which there were white activists or more activists or not enough? I'm from Kentucky. My wife is from Mississippi. And she had helped me kind of break down some of my stereotypes of Mississippi before I started this project. And so I was... So I'll answer that just personally saying that I was not surprised that there were these sort of hidden voices. There's different levels of folks, getting arrested versus someone who doesn't want to do something overt, work more behind the scenes. There was a lot more of that, and not that I expected it, but that was sort of one end result of this project. I wasn't going into it with really any expectations, but the result was to find all these folks who tried, and given what the research that I've read and the work done by other historians, it's not just in Jackson. You find this in other communities, in Meridian, for instance, as well. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. So the question was, what was the research process? I began because there very little had been written about it. So the very first thing I did was to read the newspaper, I spent a whole summer reading the microfilms to try to etch out the dates and get names of people. And once I got those names, and also doing a lot of archival work at the Mississippi Department of Archives and at the University of Mississippi, and then later elsewhere, I was able to find these people. And really, without the internet, I don't know if I would have been able to track a lot of these folks down, because most of them don't live in Jackson anymore and weren't in contact with Ed King. I will say, Ed King, he was one of the first people I contacted. I couldn't get anything except an email. And I'm one of these guys who, at the time, I didn't want to just be this random email from somebody, because you never know if it's going to get read. So part of my thing was to always mail a letter. And I would say, if you're willing to talk, call me back or email me. And that's usually how that started. So with Ed King, I emailed him. He was still part-time teaching at Millsaps in the med school down there, and I quickly got a reply, which was, I've been waiting 45 years for somebody to email about this and write about this. So it was a mix of interviews. I really geeked it out, and a lot of archives, a lot of seminary archives all over the country. I love that part of it. I really do. So I don't know. That was the process, I guess. Yes.
Among the people who said they were trying to do work, were they doing it in other arenas or only at church?
That's a very good question. I'll give one. I'm sorry. So the question was, for those who were working to integrate their church, were they doing it in other ways, like in the community? And the answer, and the best example of that is at St. Andrews. The head of their vestry happened to be head of the American Bar Association at the time. And he was one of the chief opponents of the Civil Rights Bill, or at least as he was articulating in his capacity as a lawyer from Jackson, Mississippi. However, he was the one, when students were admitted to St. Andrews, this usher comes up to him, kind of panicked, what do we do? So we're like, maybe what happened here? And he said, we're letting them in. Right? So in many ways, there were folks who drew a distinction between, what a private business owner can be compelled to do versus what a church's responsibility is. Now, beyond that, and that's just one example of someone who could somehow have both things, juggling both things. Other than that, there were many Millsaps professors, not so much in the business community. These were sort of non-business people that you would find that were sympathetic, if there was one pattern. Yeah, good question. Yes, Sandy?
I was struck when you were telling us the charges for which these people were arrested. Trespassing, I can sort of figure that out, and then interfering with divine worship, which I didn't know was arrestable.
Now you know.
I'm wondering if that ordinance might have been, that seems a strange ordinance.
Yes. Right. So that puzzled me as well. Right. And I've struggled to find, and I failed as a historian of legal measures. I could find it in the statutes, but couldn't really find where it started. But all of which is to say, though, it had been around at least since the late 19th century, and I think was designed back when a lot of these communities were very rural and it was very careful of not having a saloon too close to a place where, and I think that was more the context from what I can. So it had been around a while, and that's what I was interested in. Was this something that we just created in the 1950s? And it was not. But clearly it was very promiscuously applied, right? Because these folks are outside, they weren't disturbing in any way. There's no, they were just there. That was the disturbance. And so they were disturbing the peace by being black. I will say their cases were all thrown out. I didn't get into that. They were all thrown out in about 4 years later with the promise, the stipulation that those who were arrested wouldn't counter-sue for wrongful arrest and incarceration. That was part of the deal. Yeah. Yes, sir.
We know what Dr. King said in his letters to Birmingham about perspective and critique on pastors and ministers. Was he involved with perspective and critique on Jackson's ministry?
There were moments where they thought that he was going to come. He had talked with some of them to that effect. He had, and a lot of his folks, like Joseph Lowry, Jim Lawson here in Memphis, were also kind of on the periphery. But no, he didn't come to Jackson at this time. He was actually there the day before for this funeral, but didn't directly participate. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. I think that's time. Is that okay? Okay. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you.